Hey there, it's your sleepy historian back again. And tonight we're diving into one of the strangest, most devastating years in recorded history. Year 536, a year so catastrophically bizarre that people living through it thought the world was ending. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong. Before you scroll past, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you're into dark history. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what year of history terrifies you the most. Now, grab your favorite hot drink, maybe turn down the lights a little, and let's step back into a time when the sun literally disappeared from the sky and nobody knew why. When you think of historical disasters, you probably imagine earthquakes, plagues, or wars. But the year 536 brought something far stranger and far more terrifying. A mystery that unfolded across the entire planet at the same time, leaving people confused, starving, and absolutely convinced that the gods had abandoned them. Picture it. The year is 536. You wake up on a morning in late winter in Constantinople, the great capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The sun rises, except it doesn't. Or rather, it does rise, but something is profoundly wrong. The light that filters through the atmosphere is strange and dim, like looking at the sun through a heavy fog. Except there's no fog. There are no clouds either. The sky itself looks wrong. A sickly yellowish-brown color that has never seen before and can't quite explain. You go about your day, but the dimness bothers you. It bothers everyone. By evening, people are murmuring in the streets. What happened to the sun? Is it some sign from heaven? An omen? Nobody has answers. The problem is, this isn't just a one-day thing. The darkness persists. Days turn into weeks, and the sun remains a pale, distant disk in the sky, providing barely any warmth. Byzantine historian Procopius, a man who lived through this exact nightmare, wrote about it in his chronicles with genuine confusion and dread. He recorded that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. Imagine reading that. A first-hand account of the sun failing to be a sun. People in Constantinople started wearing heavy clothes in summer because the temperature had plummeted so dramatically. Summer. The season that was supposed to be warm and generous with sunlight became cold and miserable. Farmers watched their crops wither in the cool, perpetual gloom. The wheat that had been promised to grow failed. The barley died in the fields. Orchards that had produced for decades suddenly produced nothing. Animals behaved strangely, confused by the constant darkness. Some historians believe that livestock in many regions simply wouldn't breed that year because the lack of sunlight disrupted their biological rhythms. Cows wouldn't calve. Sheep wouldn't lamb. The animals knew something was terribly wrong, and they responded by refusing to do what they were supposed to do, which, from a survival perspective, made perfect sense. Why would you bring new life into a dying world? The cause wasn't divine punishment. It was a massive volcanic eruption in North America, likely in the Pacific Northwest. The eruption threw enormous amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing what scientists now call a volcanic winter. Temperatures plummeted worldwide. What should have been warm spring and summer turned cold and bleak. In places that never saw snow, snow fell. In the Byzantine Empire, summer snow was recorded. The crops people depended on simply couldn't grow. In Europe, the already fragile agricultural systems collapsed almost immediately. But here's what makes this even worse. Nobody knew it was a volcano. Nobody knew it was temporary. Nobody knew that the sun would eventually come back. Imagine living through that year convinced that the sun had permanently failed, that maybe the world was ending. In Rome and Constantinople, imperial authorities didn't know what to do. How do you govern a disaster you don't understand? How do you solve a problem caused by a mountain exploding on another continent that you don't even know exists? Historians call what followed the late antique Little Ice Age. But the worst was that first year, 536, when nobody understood what was happening. People didn't have the scientific vocabulary to explain a volcanic winter. They had religious explanations, superstitious explanations, panicked explanations. In Persia, they thought it was the end times. In China, imperial records noted the strange dimness and theorized that it was some kind of cosmic punishment for the emperor's wrongdoings. The Japanese emperor issued proclamations ordering his people to prepare for the worst. Priests in Rome were saying masses to beg God to restore the sun. Philosophers debated whether the natural laws of the universe had somehow broken. Ordinary people simply tried to survive, burning what few resources they had to stay warm when the weather should have been warm. Food shortages became severe almost immediately. Harvests failed across the known world. In Egypt, the Nile didn't rise as it should have. In Mesopotamia, irrigation systems became useless when the rivers ran low. In Asia, rice paddies dried out. There was nowhere on Earth where the crops didn't suffer. And because crops failed, people starved. In Europe, what had been a relatively stable, if difficult, society began to crack under the strain. The plague of Justinian, one of history's deadliest pandemics, actually started in 541, but many historians believe it was facilitated by the massive malnutrition and weakened immune systems caused by the volcanic winter of 536 and the lean years that followed. Think about it. People who are starving and living in constant cold are far more susceptible to disease. Their immune systems are shot. Their bodies are weak. When the plague came, 5 years after the darkness began, the world was already traumatized and weakened. The year 536 killed indirectly through starvation and cold, but it also set the stage for one of history's worst pandemics. Millions died across Eurasia from hunger, cold, and disease. Entire civilizations were destabilized. The Avars invaded Europe at exactly the moment when Europe was at its weakest. The Justinian Empire, which had been trying to reclaim and rebuild the fallen Western Roman Empire, found itself struggling just to survive. The social order fractured almost immediately. Trade routes that had taken centuries to establish collapsed within months because people were too busy trying to find food to engage in commerce. Why would a merchant travel dangerous roads if nobody had anything to trade? Why would cities engage in commerce if their citizens were literally starving? The entire economic system that held civilization together simply stopped functioning. Historians have spent decades studying what happened that year, and the evidence is overwhelming. Tree rings show a massive reduction in growth in 536, indicating that even plants sense the catastrophic change in climate. Ice core samples from Greenland contain a thick layer of volcanic ash from that period. The historical record from across the world independently confirms the darkness, the cold, the fear. Byzantine sources, Chinese imperial records, Irish chronicles, Persian documents, all describe a year when the sun failed and the world grew cold. And what's most fascinating is how people responded. Some civilizations collapsed, others adapted. The Byzantine Empire, despite terrible losses, managed to keep functioning because it had strong governmental institutions. China's centralized imperial system allowed for coordinated food rationing and prevention of total societal breakdown. But in less organized regions, societies simply disintegrated. The social fabric that held them together wasn't strong enough to survive this kind of stress. They didn't have enough stored food, enough governmental infrastructure, or enough population density to bounce back quickly. Now jump forward a few centuries and look at the year 1347. A different kind of darkness is spreading across the world, but this one moves with deliberate purpose. Rats in trading ships are carrying fleas, and those fleas are carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The Black Death is about to kill roughly a third of Europe's population and reshape civilization in ways that no one could have predicted. Unlike the volcanic winter of 536, which was a sudden environmental catastrophe, the plague arrived gradually, insidiously, through trade networks. Merchants traveling the Silk Road from Central Asia to the Mediterranean brought more than just exotic goods. They brought disease. The first outbreak occurred in the Crimea, where Italian merchants were trading. Traders started dying. Then ships sailed back to Italy, carrying infected rats in their holds, carrying fleas in the grain stores, carrying a curse in the form of a bacterium that nobody had a name for. Then it spread to Italy, and from there, it spread to the rest of Europe like a slow-moving death sentence. Port city by port city, village by village, house by house. People didn't understand germs, didn't understand disease transmission, so they developed their own theories. The alignment of planets, miasma or bad air, God's punishment for sin, the evil eye. They had explanations, many of them, but none of them were correct, and none of them helped. These explanations were wrong, but they at least gave people something to hold on to when everything was falling apart. The Black Death killed so many people so fast that society essentially broke down. In some cities, 70% of the population died. Not 50, 70. Fields went unworked because the farmers had died or fled. The few survivors who hadn't been struck down ran, fled to the countryside, fled anywhere that wasn't a city packed with corpses. Trade stopped because merchants were dead or too afraid to travel. Families were torn apart by the speed of the disease. Parents watched their children die in hours. Fever in the morning, buboes the sea, Z of apples by afternoon, death by evening. Children buried their parents, if the children survived long enough to bury anyone. Mass graves became a common sight. Plague pits where bodies were thrown by the hundreds, and the psychological terror was immense. People were dying of a disease nobody understood, spread in ways nobody could fathom, with no cure that actually worked. Priests died trying to give last rites. Doctors died trying to treat patients. The people who were supposed to save you were dying alongside you. What made the Black Death different from the volcanic winter of 536 was its social impact. The volcanic winter had killed people through starvation and cold, suffering that was at least somewhat comprehensible and familiar. People had faced famines before. They understood cold. They didn't understand plague. Plague was different. It was a killer that seemed random, arbitrary, impossible to predict or prevent. A nobleman could die just as easily as a peasant. A cardinal could succumb just as quickly as a servant. Death didn't respect rank or wealth or piety. And because so many people died so quickly, entire professions disappeared almost overnight. Skilled craftsmen were gone. Administrators were dead. Priests who were supposed to offer spiritual comfort were dying alongside their congregations. In some monasteries, so many monks died that the survivors couldn't even bury the dead properly. And yet, from this horror came something unexpected. Because there were fewer workers, the surviving workers had leverage. Peasants, who had been brutally oppressed and trapped in serfdom for centuries, suddenly found that their labor was valuable. They were needed. Nobles needed them to work the fields. Cities needed them to fill jobs. Suddenly, a peasant could say no. Suddenly, a peasant could walk away and find another employer offering better wages. Wages rose dramatically. Some peasants could negotiate their freedom. Some actually left their villages for the first time in their lives. The social order that had seemed fixed and permanent for centuries was suddenly fluid and changeable. The nobles who had depended on cheap peasant labor found themselves having to treat workers better just to keep them from leaving. It took a plague that killed millions, but the lower classes finally had some power. Actual, real power. Not just the power to suffer and obey, but the power to negotiate. The aftermath of the Black Death saw the beginning of a slow, gradual shift in social structures that would eventually contribute to the end of feudalism in Europe. It took a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, but change happened. The old order was broken, and something new could begin to grow in its place. The structural damage to civilization from the plague was different too. In 536, the damage was global and environmental, but societies mostly recovered because the problem was understood as temporary. Eventually, the sun came back, crops grew again, people could replant and rebuild. Restoration was possible, but the plague was different. It came, it went, it came back. Between 1347 and 1356, recurring waves of plague swept through Europe. People never knew if it was truly gone. Maybe you survived the first wave, only to die in the second. Maybe you buried half your family, and then the plague came back and took the other half. People never knew if it was truly gone, never knew if they could truly relax or rebuild. The psychological scars were different from the scars left by the volcanic winter. The plague fundamentally changed how people thought about death, about disease, about the nature of God and fate. Art changed. Medieval artists, traumatized by plague, began painting differently. Death became a common subject. The danse macabre, a disturbing style where skeletons danced with the living, became wildly popular. Death changed. Dance changed. People danced differently, more wildly, more desperately, as if trying to forget that they might not be alive next year. Philosophy changed. Theologians had to explain why a merciful God would allow such suffering. The entire medieval worldview was shaken. Before the Black Death, life had seemed stable, if grim and ordered. The plague revealed the fragility of everything. Tomorrow, everyone you love could be dead. That wasn't a metaphor in 1348. It was a real possibility, a genuine threat that hung over every person. Some historians argue that the Black Death was actually necessary for the development of the modern world. Yes, millions died. Yes, the horror was unimaginable. But the rigid feudal system died with them. New ideas could flourish because the old authorities had been decimated. New social structures could emerge because the old ones had collapsed. The massive loss of life meant that labor became valuable, which meant workers had rights they'd never had before. Innovation picked up because there were fewer people and more work to do. Necessity is the mother of invention. and Europe in the aftermath of the plague was extremely necessary. Now, what do these two catastrophes tell us about history? Both year 536 and the Black Death were turning points, moments when civilization was fundamentally altered by forces beyond human control. But they altered it in different ways. The volcanic winter of 536 tested whether human society could survive a catastrophic environmental change without understanding what was happening. In many places, it couldn't. Civilizations that had seemed stable and permanent simply collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Entire cultures vanished. But in places with strong institutions, like the Byzantine Empire and Imperial China, societies managed to endure. They didn't thrive, not for decades, but they survived, and that survival allowed them to eventually recover. The Black Death, on the other hand, was a catalyst for social change. Yes, it was horrific. Yes, it killed millions. But it also disrupted a rigid social order that had been oppressive and stagnant for centuries. It created space for something new to emerge. People suddenly had choices they'd never had. Ideas could spread because the gatekeepers of information had died. Art evolved, literature evolved, society evolved. Both disasters taught the world that nothing is permanent, that the future is genuinely uncertain, and that what seems like an eternal system can collapse or transform with shocking speed. There's a strange comfort in that lesson, actually. When you look at modern civilization, when you see all the problems we face, all the systems that seem broken or unfair or unsustainable, you can remember that civilizations have faced extinction-level crises before and survived, or transformed, or sometimes failed, yes, but that failure allowed something new to be built. The world of 536, paralyzed by volcanic winter and unable to explain what was happening, eventually recovered. The sun came back. People learned how to survive another dark year. Gradually, as the dust settled in the atmosphere and the temperatures began to rise again, societies found their footing. Trade resumed. Cities repopulated. The world healed. The world after 1348, devastated by plague and transformed by social upheaval, was radically different, but also in many ways better for ordinary people. The ordinary people had more power. The rigid feudal system began to loosen its grip. Ideas could spread more freely because there were fewer powerful people trying to control them. Progress could be made. The Renaissance, that incredible flowering of human creativity and knowledge, was partially enabled by the social changes that came after the Black Death. We live in the shadow of these historical catastrophes. Every time we see a disease outbreak, a famine, an environmental crisis, we're seeing an echo of what happened in 536 or during the Black Death. And every time humanity has found a way forward, usually in ways nobody could have predicted. So the next time you read about some crisis unfolding in the modern world, remember that we've survived worse, much worse. And we didn't just survive. We changed. We adapted. We learned. We built something different. The sleepy historian's take on all this? History teaches us that everything is temporary. Your problems, my problems, the systems we live in, they're all subject to change. That's terrifying, yes, but it's also kind of beautiful in its own way. Nothing lasts forever, which means nothing that's bad lasts forever either. And sometimes, when catastrophe strikes and everything we thought was stable suddenly isn't, something better emerges from the rubble. That's what happened after 536. And that's what happened after the Black Death. That's what might happen after our current challenges too. if we're wise enough to learn from the past and brave enough to build something better. History is full of dark years, but it's also full of recoveries, full of transformations, full of humanity finding ways to adapt and survive, and occasionally, just occasionally, to improve. So keep watching, keep learning, keep remembering, because the next time someone tells you that things are hopeless and nothing will ever change, you can point them toward 536 and toward 1347, and you can tell them that yes, things were darker then, and yes, people survived anyway.